I said, who was Carol Felstead? Well, first and foremost, she was my sister. And that's what she looked like. If you look at the badge, it says pupil nurse Carol Felstead. And Carol had a happy childhood. There were no apparent issues. My dad has always said she was an easy child to parent, which might imply that some of us weren't an easy child to parent. But she didn't do anything excessively. These headphones keep slipping down. And there were no apparent problems in her life. If there were, we're certainly unaware of them. And she was a happy person, a happy teenager. She could stand on her hands and walk. She was athletic. She played sport. She had lots of friends, couple of boyfriends, but no problems as far as we knew. Then in the mid 1980s, things changed. She became moody, sullen, difficult to get hold of. I mean, really difficult to contact. I may mention it in the TED's talk, but I used to joke it was be easier to have a conversation with the Pope and speak to Carol. Then gradually she disappeared. She vanished. We didn't know back then that when she did disappear, she was living about a few miles away from where we lived. We didn't know that. We were led to believe she moved out of the area. But there were no problems with her as far as we were aware of. And then gradually she drifted, and it almost became quite difficult to deal with. There were different reactions in the family. So some of us were angry. I was one of those persons who was cross with her. Other people, nobody knew what to do. And it became easy not to mention her because we didn't know where she was and why she wasn't talking to us. And we didn't know then that she'd actually gone to her doctor with a headache in 1985 and was referred on to psychology. I'll come on to that. But Carol became estranged from the family. She'd make a telephone call to one brother, Richard, maybe once a year, every 18 months. She always withheld a number. You could do that back then. I don't know what you can do now, but you could withhold your number. And she told Richard that she was living in London and focusing on her career. Now, nobody really believed that. It wasn't an entirely plausible situation, but we had nothing else to go on. The last time anybody saw her was in 1994, where she came up from London. She drove up here, I think, from memory, went out with two of my brothers, appeared to be a little eccentric, but again, appeared to be fine. She said she would be in touch, and they went out to a restaurant, which unusually Carol paid for. She was always broke. And she said she would make contact again and reestablish contact, but she never did. And this sort of terrible state of affairs continued throughout the 1990s. So if you fast track to 2005, out of the blue, Richard, my brother, gets two telephone calls from her. And she sounded a bit of a mess in the first one. But the bottom line was, she said she was lonely living in London. She had no friends. She wanted to move back to the Stockport area to be near her family. And I had the biggest house. So the idea was that she'd probably come and stay with me, although we didn't get down to that detail. Flash forward, 29th of June, we now know that Carol was found dead in her London flat. Now, that's an ironic date because on that day, Richard, 29th of June 2005, wrote a letter to Carol, not knowing she was dead. And that letter was to confirm arrangements for her to come up to Stockport. So, basically the gist of it was that if she couldn't drive up here, they would collect her or would pay for train tickets. But she was already dead. We weren't told about this for 2 weeks. When 2 weeks later, a coroner's officer phoned my brother up and said, I'm phoning to tell you that Carol has died. Now, if you've had a bereavement call or you've had a bereavement, it's a tough time. And literally, Richard was upset. she could tell he was upset. The coroner's officer said, would you like me to call back a bit later when you compose yourself? And he said, yes. He put the phone down. He worked from home. He walked into another room when the brother was working. They ran a business together then, quite a successful one. And he said to my other brother, David, he said, Carol's died. And David said, how she died, and put his hand to his head. He doesn't remember doing that, but Richard has a clear memory of it. 2 minutes later, and it may have even been 1 minute later, been talking about this recently, the phone rings again. Now, Richard thinks it's a coroner's officer, but it wasn't. It was another person, a person who wouldn't identify herself, refused to give her role, refused to give any basic information. And Richard quickly became clear that I had to log into this person because he knew the phone call was important. And she said, I know you're not one of the people who harmed Carol, which of course implies that somebody else has harmed her. And she invited Richard to a funeral the following day. Now, that funeral, we didn't know then, was a cremation service. And she said hundreds of people are coming to it from all over the country. None of that was true. And she said she was Carol's next of kin. And they need to come in early on this. If you're next of kin, it doesn't mean anything in law. So Harriet Harman, who used to be a Home Secretary in Parliament, quite independent of ourselves, published something about this in Hansard. And next of kin, if Lawrence says to me, Kevin, there's an aeroplane coming over Portsmouth, it looks low, it's going to hit the house, will you be my next of kin? Presumably what it means is, will you kind of make a few phone calls? What it doesn't mean is I have an entitlement to Lawrence's estate. Why would you in law? So it's a meaningless term legally. It's one we all have to give a name whenever we have a operation or anything else, but that's all it is. It's a point of contact. She said that Carol had had a very difficult childhood, and Richard said, what do you mean? You know, she didn't. And they argued about this. It went back and forth, back and forth. And basically, I can't really say how the conversation really ended because Richard made an allegation about her involvement. And what we didn't know then was that this person was a former head of ethics at the British Medical Association. Now, if you are a former head of ethics at the British Medical Association, it's fair to say you probably know something about ethics. So she knew during that phone call full well that her not divulging her personal details and other things was completely wrong and had no legal basis. We assumed when she made that call that she must have some legal entitlement. We assumed, first of all, Carol had left a will and appointed, sadly, however bad it looked for us, a non-family member to look after her estate. But when we actually looked into it, probate, there's something called the Court of Protection, created under the new Labour government, whereby if you're mentally ill, you have legal rights. We went to them, we went to the High Courts, we got something called letters of administration, and we found out that Carol died intestate, i.e. she hadn't left a will. And there's a whole list of authorities, it's still online now, where certain things have to happen in a certain order. My dad was Carol's, for want of a better term, head of her estate. And if you don't leave a will, you don't appoint anybody else. If you haven't followed those procedures, your legal status is zero. Now, I want you to think about this. Imagine this phone call took place, I think we said 9:03, but it might be 9:02, and the OCD, and in the morning. But imagine if Richard hadn't been in the house to take that phone call. There's a funeral booked for the following day. It's a cremation service, so your body's burnt. What would have happened if he hadn't taken that phone call? I say that funeral would have gone ahead without us knowing, that an inquest would have taken place without our involvement, and this whole sorry scandal would have been played out there, recorded, and it goes to something called the, I think it's a Metropolitan archive. It's an archive where records stay there for 60 years, and it would have been done, and we wouldn't have known anything about it. We wouldn't have known that Carol would have actually been dead, I don't think. at that time. So Richard has this phone call. He has this phone call with a person we now know to be Dr. Fisher, the former head of ethics. And there's different phone calls that day, but my dad has one with the coroner's officer. And she phoned him and said, do you know that your daughter's died? He said, yes, my son's told me. And there's a pause. And she said, do you know that Carol made allegations? Well, he was completely thrown off track at that point. He said, allegations? What allegations? And she went quiet again. And then she said, Carol said she was abused. And he said, well, why would she say that? There's obviously got to be some overlap with the TED's talk here. It's unavoidable. I've tried to avoid it later on. And again, she went quiet. And then she mentioned something called a life assessment document. And my dad said, what is one of those? And she said, it's a record of Carol's life. Now, you would think with a document, that's the record of your life, that you would sign it, you would date it, you would name people in it. When we eventually got this document, it's something of a battle to get it. Nobody's named, it wasn't signed, it wasn't dated, so it's meaningless again. It's not representation of anything. She mentioned allegations of sexual abuse, which completely threw my dad. And towards the end of the conversation, she went quiet and played what she thought was the main card and said, well, there was a trial. And my dad said, well, what trial? Who was in that? He said, well, you and your wife, a satanic ritual abuse trial in Manchester that collapsed after 3 days. So my dad said something along the lines, I don't know where you're getting your information from, but it's incorrect. And he asked her for a copy of the life assessment document. And she kept saying it's very upsetting. He said, well, send me a copy anyway. And she reiterated it is very upsetting. So my dad said, well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to contact the police. Now think about this. If you're a murderer or a head of a cult, are you likely to report yourself to the police? Never mind the Solicitor General later on. I'll come on to that. So we had to write this. We had this strange phone call, which I think was a data protection team with the police. And he said, my dad said, look, I've got a legal case coming up. It was an inquest. And I need you to do something. I want you to search on your computer records for a trial. Now, when the coroner's officer mentioned the trial, my dad said, when did that take place? And she didn't appear to know, which is quite alarming. And she seemed to imply it was between 1987 and 1990. So my dad said to the police, we've been told somewhere between 87 and 90, but search any time. He said, but before you do, I can tell you won't find anything because nobody's ever questioned, nobody's ever investigated. It was all a myth. So we got a letter back from the police saying they couldn't find anything on their records. Well, that wasn't a surprise. And when we sent that back to the coroner, she'd agreed to release a life assessment document. I'm not even looking at the scripts here. So when we got this document, we thought it would be upsetting. We'd been told it was, but we actually laughed at it. Went down to my dad's house. It was faxed over to Richard initially. Richard twigged it. He's the youngest brother. He twigged as soon as he saw SRA, satanic ritual abuse. He was onto it. To me, I didn't understand anything. I had no interest in it. I had no interest in memory, false memory. I'd seen the odd thing in the press years before, but I'd always turn the pages over, to be honest, or turn the TV off. And when we got this document, it alleged that Carol had been abused from birth, physically, emotionally, sexually. It alleged that my parents were the leaders of the satanic cult. We apparently kept the gowns, because we're not very clever, in a cupboard next to the fireplace. And Carol's shock at stumbling across these gowns was traumatizing, allegedly. We were supposed to have committed at least 8 murders, probably more. In later medical documents, which we acquired, Howard Shipman was meant to be a member of the cult. Carol had been raped multiple times. She'd been put in, graves had been dug up. She'd been put in the grave by my father, who had robes on, rescued by him, and she didn't realize it was him. And one of the things that's always amused me is, where were the bloody graves? And, you know, were they in the garden? Were they in the cemetery? Where were the graves? How do you actually take bodies out of graves? They put a body 6 feet down in the ground. We'll come on to that later. And so the whole thing's just so fantastical. But at the time, to me personally, it was totally confusing. I worked with the police because I preferred my police colleagues to another office I worked in. I tended to stay in the police station a lot. Going in there, and when they're saying what happened to your sister, what could I tell them? So it's just easy not to talk about it. And we didn't really know what was going on. We had no idea what Carol got herself embroiled in. And it was completely, utterly, totally confusing. So there's an inquest in 2005. Prior to that inquest, my dad had had quite a lengthy conversation with a police officer. Now, estimates vary on this conversation, but Dad thinks it was 1 hour. Richard, my brother, who's round at his house and listened to it, thinks it was 2 hours, but it was a long conversation. And my dad went through all of these claims, and it seemed the police inspector was talking interchangeably about a psychiatrist and the next of kin. And my dad said, this psychiatrist and next of kin, is it the same person? He said, well, yes. So, well, who is it? And he just said Fleur Fisher. The name was meaningless to it. My dad wrote it down and didn't do anything with it. So we had an inquest in 2005, which my dad and my brother attended. We didn't want to go in there with a big group of us. We've got these allegations. The main concern was defending against the allegations, and were they going to introduce them in the inquest? But it was actually a damp squib, basically. We didn't know then that Dr. Fisher, who'd been the caller, the second caller to my brother, had made an emergency 3-9 telephone conversation to the Met Police saying that she was worried about her friend Carol Myers. You will find her in a back bedroom. I'm afraid she may have taken her own life. That telephone conversation we were oblivious to. It wasn't mentioned in the inquest. Dr. Fisher wasn't mentioned in the inquest, and there's no reference to her at all. So nothing happened in that inquest, and there's nothing to query. Before they went into the inquest, my dad and my brother had compiled some documentation about Carol, school photographs, childhood photographs, school reports, which luckily my mum had kept everything. And they went in there. My dad said, you know, the psychiatrist who's giving evidence today, can you show her these? And she was shown all these documents, and her comment was, "Oh dear," which we interpreted as, "Oh my God, this isn't true." And she wrote a report. I will name her. Her name's Dr. Mary Howlett. I can name her. She was named in both inquests, and she wrote a report which she read out that day. But what also happened when we finally acquired Carol's medical and psychiatric records, we found that she'd written another report to Dr. Paul Knappman, who was the head of Westminster Coroner's Court. Now, if you get bored one day, just have a look at Paul Knappman, and there's a kind of ship that went down on the Thames, and he was the coroner over that. And what they'd done was, I've read a different book on this, but basically people were trapped and they chopped their hands off to free them. But they hadn't told the family members about this. It all came out years later, but it's something you might want to look at. But she wrote a report to Dr. Paul Knappman, which said, it's my understanding that all of Carol's troubles stem from childhood abuse and satanic abuse. So we have two conflicting narratives. They can't both be right. One of them must be wrong. But it was a private report, not to be read out in court. So straight away, we have two different, diametrically, fundamentally opposed narratives. The one she testified in court and one which wasn't read out in court. But we didn't know that at the time. So there's no mention of the allegations. The inquest returned an open verdict. We knew very little about Fleur Fisher, nothing practically. And we came away puzzled from it. We expected witnesses to be called, evidence to be given. On the evening of Carol's death, now you need to think about this. When people die, you write them a card, you give them space, you be respectful. But Carol's flat was sealed off as a crime scene, and the locks had been changed. And the Salvation Army turned up with a van and tried to gain access to her flat. Now, it's unprecedented. It just is. Now, how did they know about it? Who informed them? So they turned up and they couldn't get access. The following day, the police ruled that this wasn't a crime scene, that the death had been accidental. I want to, Seb, have you got a second? I want to now play you something. Now, this phone call took place on the 7th of July 2005, which coincidentally was the day of the London bombings. Okay. Now, we didn't know Carol had died then. We hadn't been told. This is Dr. Fisher in Carol's flat. Now, I know she'd removed the contents of the flat. That's not disputed. And according to the coroner, she sold some of the contents of that flat. And this is Dr. Fisher to Diamond Insurance Company asking to insure Carol's call. Now, I want you to think of one thing here. Well, several things. But this is a head of ethics of the British Medical Association. How ethical is this conversation? And think about GDPR as well. We're just getting up for you.
Can I take your name, please? You can. My name is Dr. Linda Fisher. And can I take your policy number, please? No, because I'm ringing on behalf of Carol Myers, Myers. Do you have her policy number? I do. Yep. It is DI. Yep. AMO. Yep. H23. Yep. 1221. Okay. And can I ask what relation you are to her? I'm her next of kin, and she has died. Oh, okay. And I'm ringing up. I want to be very specific about this. I'm not her blood next of kin, but she's changed her name by default, and she's my kind of unofficial daughter. Right. And I am in all documents her next of kin. Right. I'm now dealing with her flat and her possession. Okay. You know there's been a series of bombs in London. Right. I was going to drive down. I was going to go down by train to Plymouth. I can't do that. What I want to do is to see if he will now, so she's in the end of the car. Right. If you could just get me, if I could get a policy through, if you could extend her policy to me for the next 2 days, and I could drive down to Plymouth because I can't get home otherwise. Right. Okay. Bear with me. I will need to double check it for you. And I have my driving license details with me. Right, okay, bear with me for a moment. It's a rather strange figure, isn't it? Thank you for holding. Okay, because it's an unusual request, I'm going to pop you over to my manager. I'm going to go through the details with you. Yeah, the phone as well, hold on. Hello, thank you so much. Hi. I'm going to pop you through to my manager now. Right. Hello, is that Dr. Fisher? Okay, honey, that's fine. Hello. Hello, is that Dr. Fisher? I'm sorry, this is such an unusual request. I'm sorry? It's such an unusual request, I know. Well, no, it's not so much that. It's just that there are certain details I need to take because I just had my driving license card, and where have I put it? I put it in my pocket. Oh, there it is. It's on the floor. Right, I've got it, yeah. Okay, so Carol Myers, she's passed away, has she? Yeah, her official date is there. She said she may have died the day before, but she was found dead on the 29th of June. We're clearing her flat, and it's because she was sudden death. I was trying to get down to the interim death certificate, but I can't get down there today because it's Saturday and everything in London, you mustn't move, you can't move. So, right, I know today is it's been a bit of a nightmare in London, isn't it? So can I ask, are you related to Carol, are you? Well, my relationship with Carol is she changed her name by default. She was a survivor of brutal family abuse over many years. Right. Many times so are you would you therefore be the executor? I will be. There isn't a will, but I'm sort of the executor, yeah. Right, okay. She's only 41. Okay. I'll tell you one thing, do a will. You know, I've been thinking about it recently. Just do a will. I haven't done one for years, but do a will. I've never done one. I'm going to be 26 now, and I thought, well, you're only young baby, but there you go. Yeah.
Okay, Seb. Okay. Now, I want you to think that call's much longer. It's on the Justice Account website if you haven't seen it. But think of what's been said there. What's that last line? You're only a young baby. What sort of language is that to use? I don't like it. But when she's saying that, are you the executor? When she's saying, no, I will be, what she's really saying is, I'm not. So she has no legal status whatsoever. She's taking Carol's car. And what is not said in that phone call, because I've knocked on the neighbour's door, is she loaded it up with Carol's possessions, which she took quite illegally and drove to her house. That's why she wanted the car. It wasn't anything about this nonsense getting back to Plymouth. But we don't even know she's dead at that point. When we found out about this call, the way we found out about it was going through Carol's phone records. And we saw this long call. I think it was 22 minutes or 17 minutes. And basically, we phoned the number. We explained what had happened, and we asked them to keep the recording. And they were really professional with us, even though they should never have done what they did and let her insure the car. And eventually, we secured release of that recording, which was dynamite. You know, it's chilling listening to it now. I've not listened to it for a couple of years. I played it last week prior to this talk, and you know, it does make me react to it. So she's saying that call. We don't know Carol's dead, and we find out a week later, the day before her cremation is meant to take place. Talking about cremations, the cremation forms are very specific. I think it's called Form B now. It used to be Form A. But if you are not a blood relative, you have to say what your role is. And there's no legal validity. Arranging a cremation when you're not legally allowed to do so. Now, you can't do that on your own, by the way. So think about it. But we made a complaint when we gradually began to piece this together. You know, the inquest returned an open verdict. We've got Dr. Fisher's name. We haven't got any medical records, no psychiatric records. But we're starting to try to piece things together. And we eventually, I'll come on to medical records, but we submitted a complaint. I'm looking at the slide, 13th of August 2008. We complained that to the police that Dr. Fisher had attempted an illegal cremation of Carol's body, has stolen her car, has stolen her possessions, and perverting the course of justice. Basically, that investigation, which was 15 months long in timescales, when it came through, I was onto it in a flash because I'd seen police records in my previous job, and it didn't have a reference number on it. So if it doesn't have a reference number on it, it's not a real investigation. So if supposing you have a car and somebody snaps your wing mirror and you phone that in, I'm not going to say the police will do anything about your wing mirror, but you will get a crime reference number, or you should do. Without a crime reference number, it can't be prosecuted. So the police declined to take any action. We made a complaint, a detailed one, to the General Medical Council, who wrote a letter back, which to this day astonishes me, because it paraphrases everything I said in it, and it says we're not taking any action against this woman. We made another complaint to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Well, don't even go there. What a joke that was. And it was a complete whitewash. And I will argue to this day that these decisions are appalling. And when you have institutions who we look up to protect us, to keep democracy, when they fail in their job, that's one thing. When they actually cover up, you can argue that might even be worse. It's certainly as bad. So all of that's gone on. We made a complaint. It's not got anywhere. We applied for Carol's psychiatric records. Well, we didn't know how to do it, to be honest with you, but we kind of phoned up, we contacted a GP, and she said we couldn't have them, and which we thought was odd, given she's dead. And then a few years later, my dad had a conversation with somebody. He walked into his old GP's. They'd changed surgery, and Carol used to be a patient there. And she said, no, you just need to contact the primary care trust. And she pulled up the details, and she was really helpful. And we phoned them up, and they said, well, you should be able to get them. So the first batch came in 2008. So I'm a historian by training. So when we got the records, I went round to my dad's house, we laid them all out on the floor, read them, and I could see there's allusions to other records. So one letter would refer to another letter or to another report, but those letters and reports weren't there. So I knew we hadn't got the complete set. So we went back in to 2010. We finally got them on 2012. And what had happened was half of Carol's psychiatric records had been saved on microfiche. Now, I don't know, you're probably all too young to know what that is, but Lawrence will know and I will know. But you can go into your local library, and if you want to look at newspaper clippings, say from the 1960s or 70s, they may have them in the paper form, but they're not. On a microfiche, you just turn a handle and up comes this screen with them on. And I had a conversation with the person. This was my last telephone conversation. I knew it had to be electronic after this. And I said, hi, introduced myself. I said, we've got some of Carol's medical records. We'd like the rest of them. Initially, by the way, the GPs had put a big London law firm on us who refused us. And I said, well, we're not bothered about your opinions. We are legally entitled to them in law. And we were. But in 2010, I phoned somebody up and I asked him about the records. And he said, I'd referred him, I think we just launched the website there. And I referred him to the website. He said, I'm not interested in your website. I don't care about it. I said, right, okay. I said, let's start again. I said, what I'm going to do to you, Mr. Hughes, we'd had press interest by then. We'd had Private Eye. We'd had the Observer magazine. We had the Times, the Sunday Times. So I'm going to give your name out to the press. I said, when I come off this phone, I'm going to phone all three of them and you can explain to the press why you, not your primary care trust, are refusing to give these records. And I sent an email, time to land, so it was at the top of his inbox, about 9:01:23 the following morning. And then I got this groveling email back. I felt sorry for him, actually. And he said, dear Dr. Felstead, first time he used my title, yes, we're looking to releasing the records. So we got the next batch of records. But again, there was references to things that wasn't in there. And that's when we went back in a third time. And we found the stuff was on microfiche. And the woman who did that was really helpful person. I don't want to name her publicly because she's not involved in this scandal. And she kindly, in my opinion, arranged these records in quite a helpful way. So when you open the first box, the first page, Dr. Valerie Sinnison, the Tavistock Clinic, and all my suspicions were confirmed by these medical records. And what they showed was that Carol went to her GP, and keep an eye on the clock, in 1985 with headaches, persistent headaches. Ironically, I'm speaking to a retractor from Holland at the moment, and I'm not easily shocked, but this person has shocked me because she went to a doctor a bit later than Carol, not too many years later, with headaches and went down entirely the same route as Carol and has now retracted all the allegations. We're having an event on the 30th of April and we're holding a Zoom AGM, and you are a conference, you are all invited to that, and she's going to speak at it, although we've got to help her. I've got to screen her out and put structured questions to her. But she's going to speak at that. I'm interested in how she actually got out of it. I'm interested in how she got caught up in it. There will be sponsored tickets to that. I will personally sponsor 20 students to attend that. I do every year. And literally, the keynote speaker is going to be Henry Oktar from Maastricht University. Lawrence is speaking, and it's going to be a good day. And I imagine many of our members will probably not want to be identified on screen, but some of them will be. But so the records came, and they showed that Carol had gone to the doctors in the 80s, mid-80s, with headaches. They couldn't find a cause, but she was then referred on to psychology. According to one letter in there, it says, it's become clear that Carol's systematic abuse from birth, again, they use the same terms, emotionally, psychologically, physically, sexually. Carol can't remember any of these allegations, but further details will be disclosed in due course. Well, there's only two people in that room. If Carol can't remember, who's actually saying it? Well, it's not Carol, because she's saying she can't remember it. So I'm speaking to Stutch Retractor. I know exactly how they do it now. You get bullied into it. It's like Freud. He said, you know, when you get your patients in there, don't let them out of there until they've admitted that these things have happened. You know, probably it's irrelevant, but if you want my opinion on Freud, it's out there. He was a bully, a drug addict, and he was wrong. And you know, I am a big fan of Frederick Cruz, particularly second book. I like his first book, but the myth of Freud, you know, I mean, where's the ethics in that? It's just completely wrong, and it's not scientific. It's not medically based. It's not scientifically based. So Dr. Fisher gave Carol therapy in 1986. Now, when this was reported in a decent article in the Observer magazine by an investigative journalist called Will Storr, she said she'd given Carol psychosexual counselling. Now, what's really interesting is that she did one of her problems, in my opinion, is that she doesn't know when she's speaking to press. You can't talk to press like you can talk to your mate in the pub. And you have to be mindful that you may be recorded. And sometimes you are being recorded. But the psychosexual counselling turned out to be recovered memory therapy, according to Dr. Fisher. She said she's seen other people with similar problems. So Carol wasn't her only patient. Carol was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And that's really important because there are rules on that. When you're sectioned, again, there's a distinct pecking order about contacting the family. We were never contacted. Carol received hypnotic therapy for headaches. That's the bottom line on it. And she claimed she then came to believe in these preposterous and fantastical claims. She went to, this is new information, by the way, she was put in the Parkside Hospital in Macclesfield in Cheshire from January the 10th to April the 10th, 1991. So that's 3 months. It could be under section or voluntary section. Who do you think was a manager of that hospital? Anybody want to guess? I'll help you. Dr. Fisher. So Carol's in there for 3 months. Now the records which follow that, the allegations then increase. She's supposed to be in there as a safe house. This is something that comes up over and over again in her medical records. It's complete bullshit, and basically she's in there under Dr. Fisher's kind of guidance for 3 months. That's a long time, 3 months, just after Christmas. So presumably she had a breakdown at Christmas. And she spent most of the 90s in and out psychiatric units. She went to Tavistock Clinic with Dr. Valerie Sinnerson. If you don't know about her, look her up. And she's easy to find. And she went there, I think it was in the summer of 1992, and she had extensive counselling with her. And that's where a lot of this comes from. Basically, she made these allegations. Sinnerson was writing a book. Jean LaFontaine, Professor Jean LaFontaine, wrote a book wrote a paper initially about satanic ritual abuse and concluded that there are people who use rituals, and I could give you the cases, but the idea of organized satanic cults, people have looked for them. There's no evidence in the Western world that we've ever found one. And, it'd be good to find one, actually. But she wrote a book called Speak of the Devil. Now, when LaFontaine got the government report, it was from the Virginian Bottomley, who was the health secretary. Sinnerson brought this book out, which is a book by clinicians to try to kind of muddy the waters, basically. And when I first saw this book, chapter 32, it's 3 case studies, and I recognized my sister in there. I thought that's got to be Carol, because the allegations are so fantastical. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't prove any of it. But historical intuition, I don't know. That's not something I'd vouch for. But I thought that must be Carol. And sure enough, when we got the medical records, it was in there explicitly that she was Carol's first patient at the Tavistock Clinic. She went from there to the Centre for Autogenic Studies at Harley Street, Vera Diamond, deceased. In my opinion, that woman was evil. Carol had to be sedated so heavily after those sessions because she became ill. The allegations, in case you don't know as well, came out of, has anybody ever seen The Godfather? Probably not. But like there's a horse's head scene put on a pillow as a threat to people. Well, that's meant to have been done to Carol with a dog's head. I mean, as if, put in the bath, the dog's head. And where to start? But basically, she stayed in therapy. She went on to Henderson Clinic, where she went for a year, 1997 to 1998. One of the things that happened to Carol, and it isn't pleasant, it isn't easy to talk about, and I'm aware that most of you are female students, but I'll be careful with my language. But Carol came to believed these things had happened to her, and she had an aversion to touching herself in certain areas. And she had urinary tract infections. There's millions of people have them. There's at least 3, 4, 5 million people in the country have them. Lots of members of my family have them. And she had UTIs, and because she didn't do what she should have done, she got infections. And she had an operation. And surgery is great. And don't be fearful of surgery if you ever have any. I've actually had 10 operations, 10 general anesthetics. Carol actually had 10 general anesthetics, but coincidentally, but one of those operations went wrong. Now, surgery, I know somebody who's had an operation on his knee. He went wrong. He had a second one. He had a third one. The knee's worse than ever. Most forms of surgery work, but sometimes it goes wrong. And Carol's operation went wrong, which resulted in having another operation, and resulted later down the line in having a 10-hour operation where she nearly died. And they used these operations and the problem she got to back up the abuse claims. So they put it the other way around. Carol's got all these injuries on her body because she's been abused, not the other way around. So Carol came to believe this. There's no question about it. And it's not a pleasant story. And it's not unprecedented, because in the archive that BFMS had, I have looked out for this pattern. It's not a massive pattern, but there's enough cases for me to know it's happened before. So they believe in body memories. So the idea that the body remembers. I used to think this was abstract, but it's not. So, for example, I'll show you my injury site. So, see that scar on my elbow? They would say there, I broke it. It's not a big deal, but they would say that that's a sign of something that happened to me in childhood. So when Carol went to the Tavistock clinic to see Valley Sinison, according to Valley Sinison in interview with the press, Carol was limping, and she could tell by that limp that she quoted, "I knew it was her, I knew she was fleeing from them." So she diagnosed her without speaking to her because she had a limp. Now, what sort of balmy world have we entered? Where's our rationale gone? Where's Rousseau? Where's Shakespeare? Where's all our thinking? You know, all these great philosophers where we get down to this kind of sloppy thinking. It's unbelievable. And Carol limped into the room, and it's all over then. I always say in these cases, you can change your name on the file, but inside the file, there's some variations, but it's the same thing that's gone on. So the allegations: satanic cult, at least 8 murders, 6 babies richly conceived and murdered by the cult. And this is where my Dutch retractor, who I am so impressed with this woman. She's brilliant. She's so brave coming forward now. She had to go to her family and apologize to them for the allegations she's made. That takes some doing. But she believes she had babies conceived by the cult, murdered. I'll let her tell her own story on the 30th of September. As I say, we're meant to dug up graves. Carol became essentially a medical myth. She became a legend. She was known. Anybody who talked about this, Carol was our Michelle. So Michelle Remembers, which I come on to, which was published initially in Canada and then went to the middle class in America. And that book, Michelle was somebody who kind of, she basically went to see a psychiatrist who she ended up marrying. She was married to somebody else when she went to see. Now, you tell me how ethical that is. I'm not making moral judgments, but it seems a bit weird to me. But she made all of these allegations, and her GP had all the records of her family. And he said, it's nonsense. None of this happened. Now, she got exposed. Michelle Remembers got exposed later on. The Daily Mail did a good piece. The Daily Mail has lots of faults, but now and again, when it goes to these investigative stuff, it does good stuff. He's doing some at the moment on something else. But that book was a whole hoax. But what my opinion is that in this country, they wanted to get this on a funding level where you can get funding, multi-agency teams. And in order to do that, you have to have a Michelle. And Carol was our Michelle. And that's what they did. And that's what they all bought in. Everybody had heard of Carol. She wasn't an anonymous kind of sort of mental health patient. They all knew there's conferences on this. I mean, I've got all the details. So we start gathering information and watching the clock again. And after getting all the Carol psychiatric records and after finding out that Dr. Fisher made an emergency 39 phone call to police. Now, remembering that diamond insurance call, she says, we think she died the day before. Now, that's evidence. That should be mentioned in an inquest. It wasn't mentioned in either inquest. But basically, we gather the evidence. We write to the Director of Legal Services in New Scotland Yard. Now, think about this. If we're these criminals, the satanic cult murders, would I be writing to Director of Legal Services in New Scotland Yard? I suggest not. So instead, what I do, I go through my MP. His name was Andrew Stunnell, and he was part of the coalition peace talks. And we say we want this 399 telephone recording that Dr. Fisher's made on the day Carol's died. But they only keep them for a certain period. But what they do keep for a longer period is a written transcript of it called a CAD, computer-aided dispatch. So we got the CAD, and there was a phone call. So we then put together, having received that information, an application to the Attorney General's office. Now, our Attorney General, the first one was Dominic, Solicitor General in that office was Dominic Grieve. And the latest one, I'll come on to him, Robert Buckland, is now the Justice Secretary. But we put an application in there, and we say that this inquest was invalid because Dr. Fisher wasn't called to give evidence. She wasn't named, and the emergency telephone call conversation wasn't named. It's a vital piece of evidence. And we put other things together. We had to learn the law and apply the law. This is one thing that people struggle with. You can have your theories, you can have your ideas, you can have your evidence, but you still got to apply it to the law. If you don't use the law, then it doesn't happen. So we go in there and they quash it. They give us permission to go to High Court. And when you go in the High Court, they call them red judges because they wear red robes. They sit very high up. It's a class system of this country. We're all lowly and inferior. And basically, they quash it on our first point. And those, you've got it up on the slide, haven't you? The two judges, Mr. Justice Ousley, and he's on a Judge Peter Thornton QC, who was the Chief Coroner for England and Wales. These are not lightweights. And your High Court judges, with the greatest respect to Crown Court judges, it's no comparison in intellect and particularly in understanding of the law. And we're litigants in person. We've done it ourselves. When we were in there at that, a person came in and sat next to me. And the Press Association were based in there. I think they still are based in the Royal Courts of Justice. And he came over to me. He said, "What are you doing in here?" I said, "Well, we're here for an inquest." He said, "I've been coming in this place for 17 years." He said, "I've never seen anybody overturning an inquest. And I've never seen a litigant in person in here." And somebody had tipped him off about that case. I don't know who it was, but somebody had. And it felt like a real turning point, and we were looking forward to our day in court. So, cut a long story short, a new inquest is convened for 2015. Before inquests, you have something called pre-inquest review hearings. We didn't have any in 2005. We should have had one. But because we'd learnt the law, we insisted on them. There's best practice on those hearings, i.e. you should have an agenda. And the interested parties, us as a family, should be informed of all of that. So we had the first one, which was in March. Happened to be on my birthday, actually. And that was an interesting birthday. The second one was in June. And there's a third pre-inquest hearing in September and a full inquest hearing on the same day. But we went in March. We do the formalities. You have to be respectful of the court. Good morning, ma'am. Blah, blah, blah. I'm sat in front of my family because I've got the legal stuff to do. And she said, "Oh, you've got the short straw." I said, "It looks like it, ma'am." And she said, "Right, my take on this case is that it was a sudden death. We were given a bundle of documents which had been carefully paginated, prepared. And I thought, how can we jump to a conclusion when we haven't even looked at the evidence?" So straight away, I knew all was not to be as we'd hoped for. When we went into the June pre-inquest hearing, she disclosed some evidence, police evidence that we hadn't seen before. It's my opinion she hadn't read that evidence. I don't know, but it's my opinion she hadn't because the devil was in the detail. But I did read it. And as I said to her in my hearing, "Ma'am, I can quote the evidence. I think it's a futile kind of exercise because I can remember it. I'd read it that many times, so I knew where the documents were. But on that one, Dr. Fisher's meant to have made a series of phone calls, not just a 399 emergency phone call from Manchester, but other phone calls on a mobile. She's meant to be in various in Nottingham, in Birmingham, Wolverhampton, off a train, off to Plymouth, off to London. And we purchased on eBay a train timetable map from 2005. And I marked all these things out there. The journeys are impossible even then, in the timescales allocated. Trains are faster now. And I pointed this out, but she didn't want to hear it. But I was determined to get it minuted, and I wasn't stopping. And I got all that down, and I went through it. Said, so ma'am, I said, the journeys are not just wrong, they're impossible. They can't be done. And I'd actually made inquiries, to back this up with British Rail and everything. I'd got all the timetables for 2005 and later. So her whereabouts were uncertain. When we had the second inquest, 2 days before, I was threatened with contempt of court. That's a very real thing that you can get. And if you get contempt of court, you're dead in the water, in my opinion. So basically, they sent a detailed email from a legal team to me. And it was saying if we went out of bounds, we couldn't mention the SRA allegations, we couldn't mention the counselling and all of that. And so I said, well, we're withdrawing from proceedings. Now, that's what I said by email. And then when we had the pre-inquest hearing in September, she had to ask me, will you go ahead with the inquest? And we said, yes, but contempt of court, I'll give you a couple of other examples. I've been threatened with contempt of court, as explained to Lawrence earlier, in Liverpool Crown Court in 2017, when I was sat in the public gallery, just me, for a 5-week trial. And then one day, loads of members of the public, some of them students, rocked up and sat in the public gallery. I didn't particularly pay any attention to them, I was listening to the evidence. The following morning, when I'm back in there, just me, a note gets sent up from the jury to the judge. And it says, a member in the public gallery was staring at me yesterday. And I'm thinking, this is awkward. And the judge said, well, now I've been made aware of this, I will take it into account and threatened with contempt of court. One of the defence barristers, with two, had to get on her feet and say, look, he's professionally involved with the case. He's been here, I think this is the second or third week in the case. He's been here ever since, he's involved in the case beforehand, and there are lots of people in the gallery. But the judge was having none of that. So from that day, I've got the judge in front of me here and the jury to my left. I have to turn this way for the next 2 or 3 weeks, which I did my neck in and my back, and I had to have physio. I went to Ipswich Crown Court. Let's get these back on. Hang on. A couple of years ago. Sorry. I have to hold him, I think. I'll put it on my head. And basically, in Ipswich Crown Court, there's loads of hanging about. So I took a Kindle and I had to go through security. And on the first day in court, I made some notes. I didn't identify anybody, but you're allowed to make notes. And the clerk came up to me and said, sir, you're making notes? I said, I am. And he said, may I see them? I said, absolutely. I said, nobody's named in them. But I decided, in the interest of transparency, I'd destroy the notes. So I put them in a waste paper bin. And the following day, when I got to court, I looked in that bin, it hadn't been emptied. So my torn up notes are there. And I went into court, and somebody said to me during this case, have you seen how the police are reacting around you? And I said, I have. I think somebody worked out that I worked for BFMS, or we'd had some publicity at the time. I read that. And so wherever I went, these two police officers followed me. So I then went over to a group of criminals. I can't call them that because they're all, I'd heard the barrister advise them to plead guilty. If you plead guilty, you'll get a suspended sentence. So I went over and said, how's it going, guys? What's your judge like? And had a chat to the crims, which wound the police up more. I went back into court after that. It was in the afternoon. The judge said, I want to address the public gallery. Again, just me, sadly. And he said, yesterday, you were making notes. Okay. This morning, you were chewing gum. And this afternoon, you brought a Kindle into my court. The barrister's not getting on his feet because he's having a tough time with his judge and doesn't want to jeopardize his case. So I stood up and said, well, with respect, Your Honour, I did make some notes yesterday. Then the bin outside, they're torn up. I can go and get them if you want to see them. I said, just for the record, I said, I've never chewed gum in my entire life. In fact, it's a habit I quite despise. I said, and third, I have brought a kindling to court because, as you are aware better than I am, there's a lot of hanging around in these buildings. He said he has been through security. I told him the book was reading, and I offered to send it up to him, and he went, "Ugh, I don't think you should bring a kindling to my courtroom." But you can't get contempt of court for doing nothing. Anyway, I digress. So we're at the 2015 inquest. Dr. Fisher gives evidence by video recording. There's a light above her head. She's put in something called special measures. That's common for witnesses. It's used right across the criminal court justice system. But she's written a 106-page statement for the inquest. The coroner's redacted 87 pages, i.e. blacked out 87 pages. Every other page got redactions on it. The only page where bits are not redacted are all against us, with bits of allegations, and we get new allegations that we've never even seen before. We're not even in any of the psychiatric records. We're not cross-examining, but you get an opportunity to ask witness questions. So I asked Dr. Fisher when she first met Carol and when she last saw Carol. Dr. Fisher said to us that she testified on oath. Do you want me to carry on or do you want a break? Lawrence, do you want me to carry on or do you want a break?
You can carry on if you would like to.
Yeah, sure. Just get to the end of this slot. It's not long. So Dr. Fisher testified that she first met Carol on a sunny summer's day in June 1985. To which I responded, I'm very impressed with your clear recollection. Carol, she said, is delivered to her like a takeaway pizza by the Samaritans. Now, a few years ago, my dad had a conversation with Samaritans. They don't do face-to-face. In fact, it's completely cross their ethos. So whatever happened that day, Dr. Fisher, Carol was not delivered to Dr. Fisher by the Samaritans. Dr. Fisher described what sounded like consulting rooms on the side of the house. And she said Carol wouldn't speak, was frozen, paralyzed by fear, too traumatized to talk. And she said, right, come back again. And she set up an appointment with her. And Carol brought a folder, a brown paper folder. And in it was all these allegations. Dr. Fisher said, I've never seen anything like it. Dr. Fisher then became Carol's doctor for a while. And she's on the record as saying how do you put this? Carol had an internal, and Dr. Fisher said, I know what my hands were telling me. Now, so you're telling me that by examining somebody, you can tell that they've been abused. I'll leave it to female students to make your own mind up on that. So she gives her evidence. I asked her, when was the last time she saw Carol alive? Because I've got various versions of this. And I've got the phone records. And I asked her the last time she spoke to Carol. So I know what the records say. There's a whole thing happened at this inquest that I completely missed because I was so focused on her. She's on a screen, which was high up, and I'm focused on the coroner. And what happened was, literally, I'd mentioned Carol's phone records, and the coroner's saying, well, I haven't got them. Well, she actually had been given them. But she also knew that when I say I've got the records, I really have the records. So I then passed them up to her. And the barrister next to me, I said, I've also got, I've got a copy of a report of the complaint we instituted against Dr. Fisher to police. Now, this barrister clearly didn't have it. Now, while I'm doing all this, and he said, I haven't got that. And because you're litigants in person, you don't have to go through formal procedures. You don't have to send everybody out of court, make an application to hear this evidence, blah, blah, blah. But I said, would you like a copy, sir? And just handed it to him. I was prepared for it. And then what happened when he read it, unbeknown to me, he dropped all his papers on the floor, but I completely missed it. So I've got him here, and I've got a barrister for the NHS Trust who was smiling, cheerful, and I could see was, neutral. But he drops all his papers, and according to people aware, he shuffles them all together. And then I say no further questions. And what I had to do, I knew Dr. Fisher was getting teary, and I couldn't allow that to happen. So I literally got out, but I'd asked all the questions that I wanted to ask. This is the first time I've stated this publicly, but there were 2 inquests going on that day. There's the inquest that happened, but I was also trying to get enough grounds to appeal this inquest, to get a second one. I questioned the police officer about when she left Carol's flat on the perceived day of her death. And I had a record in front of me, and I knew she was 1 hour, 3 minutes out in her answer. But if I'd have said to her, oh, well, according to her records, it says this, she said, oh, sorry, the passage of time, memory, blah, blah, blah. But I just wanted it logging into the record. Cut a long story short, we get the audio tapes, we get the written transcripts, and we make another application to the Attorney General's office. We're litigants in perpen. To get a fiat from the Attorney General's office, that's a legal authorization, is no mean feat, I can tell you. And Robert Buckland, who's now the Justice Minister, is nobody's fool. He knows the law. And you have to evidence it. If you don't have the evidence, you won't get it. You can have a strong case, but without the evidence, without the law, you don't get through there. In fact, somebody told me that our chances of getting through there was less than 1%. And if you go to High Court, your chances there are less than 1%. We did both. So we send this second one in. And the main point is this. Dr. Fisher's testified on oath that she made the 39 emergency phone call from Manchester. So she's phoning in saying, I'm worried about my friend Carol Myers who found in a back bedroom. Well, there's one hiccup with that, which we were aware of. If you make a phone call at Manchester railway station, which police force do you get put through to? You don't get put through to Metropolitan police. You get through your local police force. So if I phone now and I make a phone call here, I don't get put through to Plymouth police. I don't get put through to Scotland police. I get put through to GMP. So she cannot, we argued, she could not have been in Manchester. She must have been in the London area. So that was our first point, which you put in. There were others based on the evidence, the inquest transcripts. And on that point, the inquest was quashed on that point. So literally, we've got the second fiat. We can go back to the High Court to ask the inquest to be quashed again. There's some problems with that because, first of all, you can only call the same witnesses. You're not going to get any different evidence. The coroner was arguing. She said she wanted to defend this one. The first application didn't defend. They have an active litigation team. They're in court a lot. And you can go in there, and she would have argued, according to her own submissions, that Dr. Fisher's whereabouts was irrelevant. I say it's absolutely material. Facts do matter. So, as I'm fond of saying, the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066, not 1065, not 1067. The American Civil War took place in 1861. It finished in 1865. It didn't take place in 1741 and finish in 1745. The facts do matter. So we literally have to debate this. And what's happened is you put your applications in, you go and lodge your application fee with the court. I won't bore you with that, but that's a saga. And literally, we get all our information in on time, and the coroner with a big legal team fails to make the deadline. So we then put in an application that she's out of time. An out of time application means that you can be allowed in the proceedings, but you can't participate in them. So it's a one-track race, basically. The coroner writes a response, gets a 1 month extension by somebody called Master Giddon in the Royal Courts of Justice, and she argues that we've got the Grenfell Tower inquest and the work is burdensome, and they gave her an extension. If we'd have been 1 minute over, it's my opinion, we'd have been out. And I know somebody it's happened to who was about an hour over. So literally, she gets an extension. At the same time, we've got to balance things. So you can go into that court, and even if you win, you can incur legal costs. If she'd have argued that, look, this is your second time in the Royal Courts of Justice, you've had all these pre-inquest things, you've had a full inquest hearing, you've not really paid anything about your application fees, that she wants part of her cost paying, they can give you a 14-day order on costs, and you can run in very, very quickly to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. There's a recent case, I'm going to avoid naming these people because we read about them every day in the press at the moment, but one side got £700,000 legal costs for one hearing. So it can happen. So we withdrew from proceedings purely, and I stress purely, on the grounds of costs. I wasn't bothered about their legal team. We've got the evidence, bring it on. But at the same time, we submit an exhumation application to Ministry of Justice. That comes back within a week of submitting it. 13 days is it? Bearing in mind, you've got 4 non-working days with your weekends there, and they give us an exhumation license. Now, again, I can't stress how difficult it is to get that. This is not a normal exhumation license. If your loved ones die, and say they live in Scotland and you live in Manchester, you can actually apply for an exhumation license for their remains to be moved, but you can't have any DNA done on them. It's a different license. We got that signed off, and it happened so fast. It threw us a bit, to be honest, because then you've got to get to work. You have to have an external exhumation team. We have to contact the cemetery manager, our local hospital. The cemetery manager had to go to her bosses. You have to find a pathologist. And we'd been told years ago we were going to apply for an exhumation license. There's always real problems about Carol's identification. There were 2 letters in her kind of file, and they had the same reference number on, but different names. And literally information was missing. Scene of crime photographs are missing, and other vital information. Coroners don't lose these things. They do not lose them. They go into something called the Metropolitan archive, and you could access them decades later. So there was always problems around the identification process. So we basically contacted a pathologist, Home Office pathologist, a very senior one, and go further. He's director of medicine at Cardiff University. He's nobody's fool. If you look at some of the jobs he's done, well, he goes out with juries to murder sites and other things. And all of this comes together. And basically, on the day of the exhumation, I get there first, the car. And the way this cemetery is configured, you park at the bottom and you walk up to it. And I can see the grave, and I can see a trolley with the coffin on top of it. I can see a vehicle to the left outside the offices. And they, ironically, they thought I was press because we're all booted and suited. And I went over to them and introduced myself. And they explained what had happened. They said, right, so on this trolley is your mother, because my mother died after Carol. She died through what happened to Carol, in my opinion. She got stress, her hair turned grey, she got cancer, and she died in that order. And she could never come to terms with the allegations, whereas we could kind of later on configure what had happened. She couldn't. And she said, in that vehicle over there, that's your sister. Then we went into the office where the staff were, and the pathologist was there. And he said to me, you're absolutely right to have done this. He said, in all my professional experience, I've never, ever seen a case like this, ever. And he said to me, I've got to ask you a question. Do you have any idea what your plan will be if this isn't the sister? He said, because I have absolutely no idea who I'm going to find. Should I do the pathology? And I said, yes, we do. That would have been a press conference. Interestingly, right, people apparently who can't sleep, who have insomnia, walk the dogs in the cemetery in the middle of the night. I'm not making this up. So we had to put 2 people on the gates, 2 people dug the graves out. That took all night. And 2 people of security on the grave. It's a big operation. And we'd been told when Carol died in 2005, you know, my brother phoned up to the colonial office and said, look, this cremation, can we stop it? And she said, yes. And that's at that point we knew that it had no legal validity, because you couldn't stop a funeral. You couldn't. It would go ahead. And when she said yes, that was a game changer for us. We knew something was wrong. We didn't know what had happened. We knew something was wrong. So basically, back to the exhumations. So he says that. We then go in vehicles behind, like a funeral procession. When a body goes into a grave, you never think it's going to come up again. And nothing prepares you for that. Nothing at all. And literally, we go to our local hospital, and my brother's got a mobile number. He makes a call on that mobile number, And the pathologist, the head pathologist, comes and meets us on the corridor. And we're taken for the first time to bereavement room. It was quite, oh, wow, first time we've been treated as bereaved. And it was an all-female pathology team. The person who was over, the Home Office pathologist, was male, but that meant something to me because most of the people who'd abused Carol, and I use that word deliberately, were female. And so we'd now finally met the good guys, if you like. And they were brilliant. We'd been told when her body was sent up here in 2005, Carol had a family funeral, a small one, because we're being accused of allegations. We don't know what they're about. We can't tell anybody. We can't write anybody. It was awful. But we were told that her body was so decomposed that they had to seal the coffin. So they go away. The pathologists, they all get scrubbed up in green gowns from memory. 1 hour later, we come out, we get an update. And she said, Carol's remarkably well preserved. I said, what do you mean? She said that she's got virtually a full head of hair. Apparently, she'd been put in a bag, which is not uncommon. And the soil where she's buried in was remarkably good. So what it meant was the whole exhumation, the whole pathology was going to take a lot longer. So it actually did. The external exhumation team had been paid a fee, but we'd only been paid until lunchtime. And when we literally, I'll come on to it in a second, but they wouldn't take any more money. Anyway, after the pathologist was finished, he showers, cleans up, and meets us in a room. And I said to him, before you do anything, can I ask you a question? You know, why won't you take any payment for this? And he wouldn't. He worked pro bono. And he said to me, and it does get to me this, so you have to forgive me. He said, I'm for the Biggles era. He said, because it matters. He said, I tell my students first and foremost, don't forget that you are a doctor. And second, if you mess up years down the line, it can be very difficult to put right. And then we'd given him some additional information, even with a sort of exhumation license with pathology. There's only certain limits you can go to. It's all got to be legal, basically. But we had given him some additional information. He said, from what you've told me, I'm pretty convinced this is your sister. But then what had to happen, the following day, we had to get up early, go to GP surgery, not our surgery, before anybody else got there, and give DNA. This got funny because the person who was doing it, we'd read the forms carefully, we'd filled them in. When we got there, he said, you need a passport photo. He really didn't, according to the literature. But we couldn't afford to get into an argument. So off we went to a supermarket, and literally, guess what? The picture machine had packed up the night before. You couldn't take a photograph. So we found another one. We got the photos. We came back. They took DNA. Because of scientists, they check things. So 1 week later, their analysis was sent to another lab to double check it. And the DNA came back quite high for everybody, positive, but mine was off a scale. And the chances numerically of Carol and I not being biological siblings was 3.5 million to 1 against. So that DNA was conclusive. It was a shock to me, actually, to get that. And I think we should probably stop there. I'll just carry on. And then what happens after you have your exhumation and after you have the pathology, you have to go back to cemetery, and the bodies are then reburied. So it's completely horrendous. It's completely horrific, and you have to go in, you have to put them in. And the exhumation team, again, they wouldn't take any payment for this, and it's kind of traumatizing because you never think you're going to see a body when it's come out of the ground. But bizarrely, because the cemetery manager was trying to amend all the bad things that had happened to us, and the pathologist said to me, incidentally, said, I want to apologize to your family for what the system has done to you. And he hadn't done anything, you know, he's worked for nothing, and that it still gets to me, actually. So the bodies were reburied. And the cemetery manager said, do you want to take a photograph? And quick as a flash, my wife takes a photograph. I've not been able to look at it. I know where it is. And I think what she's trying to do is to just put right what's gone on before we got to these people. I will stop there.